However, the next piece here takes us down the road of, first, what I'm going to argue is largely the elimination of, or at least the potential elimination of much of the abnormal category. And then we'll see before the end of the evening the language that is possibly in play for even taking that further to what it would look like to begin to question the viability of the normal category itself. Okay? So what we're going to enter into now in Roman numeral 2 is what's known as the topic of ktamim, literally stains. Okay? And what we're dealing with here is essentially evidence of bleeding, evidence of uterine bleeding, that is, I think the simplest way of describing it, that is discovered after the fact. That is to say, rather than being experienced in the moment, is discovered after the fact, and therefore on some fundamental level presents some question as to how much I'm even sure this came from my body. Right? Now, that question gets played out in kind of two different ways, right? And there's two fundamental different perspectives on this whole category, which I think we'll see in the very opening dialogue here. Is this conversation, and should it be about, actually getting into a question of evidence? It's about, I'm looking at the circumstantial evidence of whether there was bleeding here, and whatever leads me to the more reasonable conclusion is what I will follow. And so it's really just sort of a fact-finding mission where there are certain canons of expectation that develop of what is or is not reliable evidence, but at the end of the day, we're looking for the sum response to the data as whether it indicates bleeding or not. Or, another way this topic, I think, over time increasingly is dealt with is, what is not on the table to be constructed as the blood that I worry about, even if I basically know it comes from the body? That is to say, it's less a category of evidence and more on some level a category of psychological displacement. Right? The difference between those two will be stark, because the more someone feels they are searching for evidence, the more they will be unlikely to want to take some of the displacement mechanisms to their logical extreme. And the more someone thinks this is about psychological displacement, and I would argue to you possible elimination of the abnormal data, the more someone will be perfectly happy, even when they're fully aware that blood is coming from the female body, to say, that's fine, it doesn't count as dam niddah or dam ziva. Yeah?
Sorry, in the beginning you were talking about evidence after the fact. I'm not clear on what the fact is here. After.
Well, so the fact is already misleading, right? The question was, are we talking? What's the evidence? What's the fact? The evidence that this is after which? The notion of let me say it this way: that to the extent there was bleeding, any evidence I have from it was discovered after the fact. That is to say, there was not
after the bleeding had stopped.
Correct. Now, of course, it might not have happened at all, right? Part of the question on the table in some of these sources is, was there bleeding at all? Or, for instance, is this like the blood of a mosquito? Right? Like in certain circumstances, there'll actually be a question as to what happened at all. The after the fact is, to the extent there was bleeding, I am discovering possible evidence of it rather than responding to an experience of it. That's what these sources are mainly dealing with. Okay? I think sometimes they're actually cloaking some other things, but that's the explicit level of the conversation. Okay? All right, so let's see. Someone please volunteer to read for me. Mishnah Niddah, page 1, at the bottom. A woman once came to Rabbi Akiva. Please.
A woman once came to Rabbi Akiva. She said to him, I saw a snake. He said to her, yes, but it healed. He said to her, perhaps it might have been able to reopen and emit blood. He said, yes. He declared it tahor. Rabbi Akiva saw his students looking at one another. He said to them, why does this bother you? The sages only said this in order to be lenient, not to be strict. For it says, when a woman has a flow, the blood shall be a flow in her flesh, blood and not a stain.
Dam velo ketem. All right, now let's focus in on this interaction, right? Rabbi Akiva's students, let's start with them, right? It's always important in a text like this where someone's making an innovative claim to see the reaction so you get a sense of what came before the innovative claim. The students are clearly looking at one another because they seem to be saying some version of, we obviously know that this blood came from this woman's body. How could you possibly rule tahor? How could you possibly rule in the way that you are ruling? Right? And so the backdrop to Rabbi Akiva seems to be, what do you mean? Like, the Torah gives me these rules. If the woman basically experiences it as coming from her body, that's what the evidence seems to add up to, then the conclusion is you feed right into the system and then apply all of the things that we talked about for the past 3 weeks. Rabbi Akiva says something different. He says, dam velo ketem. The Torah actually only forbade dam, which is blood, right? Actual live blood. Not the stain of blood, not the evidence of past bleeding, but actual blood. Now what's that about? What is that statement about? Dam velo ketem. If you're to make it something more than just a tendentious claim of I'm trying to find a way to say tahor about this person, but that this actually is trying to capture something about what that chapter is dealing with. Yeah?
Seems like he's saying it needs to be a continuous state. And if it's no longer in effect, then I can't. I mean, that logic is problematic to me, but it seems like you can make the case to be saying it's not ongoing, then it's not included in our issue.
All right, so let me push you further on that. Let's say that this is a distinction between an ongoing state of bleeding as opposed to there was a point in time that was discrete, and now it's after the fact. Well, why is that significant? What would be the substantive weight behind making such a distinction, where one is tameh and one is not, right? Where one falls in the category of niddah and one does not?
I mean, I can't really, because of the kind of conflation that we talked about last week, it becomes much more complicated, but certainly as niddah, it seems like the category from originally we're talking about niddah needs to be something that goes on for more than just a period term. It's not the same thing as like, there's a finger on the needle, something like that.
Okay, so one possibility is that Rabbi Akiva is actually eliminating the category of zava, or trying to the extent that most cases of ziva that he's afraid of will be some kind of minor short-term spotting, right? That will effectively come in sort of in those interim days. And as long as I'm discovering it after the fact, and note, I have some way of attributing the blood to some other source, right? He doesn't just say, it's a stain, therefore it's gone. It's a stain, therefore we can deal with it leniently, something like that, right? Then he actually can potentially affect the elimination of most abnormal cases. Now, by the way, why is it not crazy to say that? Because the most prominent voice in the elimination of the category of male zavim is Rabbi Akiva. Okay? So that's one possibility.
It also seems like it could just be like, how often do people wash their clothes? Like maybe you saw a stain, maybe it was from 3 weeks ago. Like,
Meaning that it actually is quite extensive because everyone's got stains all over the place. Meaning it's not...
I think that like, you can't necessarily reliably get a stain out of something, but just because you see a stain on something,
Aha.
doesn't mean that there was recently blood on it. There could have been
I
blood
see.
on it.
If we had a standard whereby stains are taken too seriously, that could be a problem in a world in which there are any number of stains because of the standards of hygiene, laundry, etc. Yeah.
I think that, right, the fact that like a woman came to Rabbi Akiva, right, like is indicative of that it's probably not regular menstrual flow. Like she probably knows what her period is like. She wouldn't need to go to a rabbi to discuss that, right? This is something that's abnormal, which I think leads credibility to your thought that it's not like it's clearly not about niddah.
Okay, so the whole notion that the story comes up almost sounds like it's an unusual case and that we're dealing with something having to do with ziva. Okay, was there another thought over here? Okay, so another thing I'll just throw out, which might even dovetail with the language you used, but I think is just a slightly different way of thinking about it, is it might also be a way of talking about essentially that the state of body that Vayikra Tetvav is concerned about is one of experiencing your body doing something, as opposed to the discovery of something that your body did in the past tense. Right? It might actually be a substantive claim that part of what Vayikra Tedvav is trying to engage with is, I'm feeling my body doing something right now, and it requires some kind of response. And therefore, Rabbi Akiva might be arguing anything that is kind of off the grid of that basic formulation, and that is fundamentally about my trying to find data points that might retroactively point out to me that I'm in a certain state, could be not what the Torah actually is even talking about or interested in, and therefore is appropriately downgraded. Okay? Yeah, Jana, and then Alan, and then we're going to move on. Yeah.
So this is assuming that the state of Niddah is something that is always presently experienced in some way, like, and that a woman knows when this is happening, rather than, it could be a woman who has a very light period, doesn't notice it, looks later and says, oh, there was blood.
Okay.
It's like, couldn't it happen that she just always sees stains?
Great. So wait for 20 minutes, and we're going to get to exactly that. Okay? Excellent. Yeah.
I'm wondering if there are any other areas of questions of Sahara that are dependent on a person's sensory state as opposed to objective evidence.
So again, wait 20 minutes, and we're going to get to that. Okay? Good. Excellent. So this notion of dam velo ketem, okay, which Rabbi Akiva innovates. Right? It's blood. It means blood, which means some live flow of blood, and it does not mean evidence of blood. Okay? Then produces an entire discourse that we're now going to see very quickly of various ways of saying, actually there's all kinds of evidence that the body might produce or that we might find around us that can be discounted. Okay? And his students, you can see this if you go through the different generations, you see it's only after Rabbi Akiva that this starts, and after Rabbi Akiva, generation after generation, different voices chime in to sort of jump on this bandwagon of how might the world of dam velo ketem play out as we expand it further and further. So on the bottom of 1, top of 3, we find, top of 2, Mishnah 9:3, we find one of the more dramatic categories as is relevant for our own day, which we'll get to. 3 women sit on a bench and blood is found on it. All are tmeot. Okay, now here the issue is, the blood came from one of them. I have no way of fairly determining which one it came from. Therefore, by virtue of basically evidentiary stalemate, all 3 of them have to be tmeot. I can't pick one of them, and I can't make all of them tehorot, because clearly someone is tme'ah. Therefore, all 3 are tme'ot. This, by the way, is not just local to this. This comes up in all sorts of other areas where all sorts of other sources deal with these kinds of essentially, right, like math and fact pattern problems in this way. Again, the systemization of this topic we talked about last time. But here's what we're interested in. If they sat on a bench of stone or on the bench of a bathhouse, Rabbi Nechemia mitaher. For Rabbi Yechemia used to say, anything that does not receive tumah cannot receive a stain. Now, I want you to understand, Rabbi Nechemia's position here has nothing to do with the facts having changed as far as what is likely to have transpired here. The only thing that changed was the material of the bench. Okay? And the material of the bench changing reverses the ruling for him. Now, why? Well, clearly, the notion of a ketem and all of this is tied up with notions of tum'ah. And Rabbi Nechemia seems to be saying that the need to have the object on which the stain falls be somehow involved in the world of tum'ah is a prerequisite to it triggering this as relevant evidence. Not everything is able to become tameh. Among the things that cannot become tameh in the material world are objects of stone, are also the ground, are also any number of other materials. Now, what does Eino Mekabel Tumah basically mean in rabbinic literature as a category, if you're to talk about it not just as a list? It essentially means 2 kinds of objects in the world. One is, whether it's stone or the ground, things that essentially have not really left their natural form. Things that are essentially the world as it is. So yeah, you carved up the stone, but stone is not really transformed by human activity. in the same way that most of the other materials that human beings work with are. That's category one. It's things that haven't really entered into the human realm. And the other thing, which goes to, right, other things that don't receive tumah in rabbinic literature are broken vessels, right? Things that have already been shattered, that are useless for their purpose. Basically, garbage. Right? Garbage is not makabel tumah. That is to say, things that you throw out, that are not usable. They've entered the human realm, but they've been so used in the human realm, right? Or they're so temporary that they're not sticking around with you. They're not the kind of thing that you have with you as an extension of yourself, such that you confront them in the same way. Rabbi Nechemiah seems to be saying, not just in a formal way, but in a substantive way, what it means to encounter the ketem means to encounter it on something that is a kind of a usable extension of yourself that you use and do things with, as opposed to something that is basically just a part of the natural world, or right in a raw state, or something that is here today, gone tomorrow, is disposable. Okay? That's one, category one. All right? Is davar she'ino mekabel tumah. Conclude that a sanitary pad is not mekabel tumah. You can imagine where that goes. We'll get to that. Okay? Habeged hatzavua, colored garments. In the Tosefta, the dominant view says that a colored garment cannot receive a ketem. Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef says it does. What do you think the colored garment exemption is about? Why might that not be determined evidence of a ketem? It's not white. Yeah? Jenna?
How do you know that wasn't just a pattern of the dye, or, you can't necessarily differentiate it from the color it's supposed to be anyway, so you can't quite say, oh, this part's a little bit darker, maybe it's blood. It doesn't seem very...
All right, so one possibility is once I have some kind of, assuming your argument would work better for something where there's actually like multiple colors or some kind of pattern, and who knows how this fits in, but once it's already been dyed in some way, I'm already unsure, vis-a-vis almost using the evidentiary frame that I talked about. Who knows? Maybe there's some other splotch of dye that got on that thing. Okay, other thoughts on what that category might be about? Yeah? Okay, so if we're focusing on the clothing in particular, not just on the corollary for sexual intimacy, but actually does the clothing become tameh, then there might be some kind of drive of being concerned that the colored garment does not receive tumah, right? That would be the sort of socioeconomic thrust to that. Great. One other possibility I'll just throw out to you, again, sort of from the psychological frame, is that on a colored garment, the redness that is at the source of the dam concern is simply not as pronounced as on white. And it may be that one of the motivations and foci here is, well, actually, since this is all about how much do I have to kind of confront this thing, then it being, not because I think that the person who dyed the clothing put this in, but because it simply doesn't stick out at me in the same way, it may be more easily displaceable on a psychological level. What have you? It's another category here of an entire area of tamim that potentially gets thrown out. Okay, someone read me Tosefta Niddah chapter 7 for really the most famous example of dismissing stains, but the language of how it gets off the ground is very interesting. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Someone want to take this one? Tamar.
Rabban Shimon bar Gamliel said, she still allows, she can dismiss the blood. And if not, she cannot. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, I say something and they say something. What I say is extreme, and what they say is extreme. What I say is extreme, there is no woman who is not to allow. What bed has no light? What they say is extreme, there is no woman who is not to may ask. There is no sheet without drops of blood. Fanina ben Antinos is more reasonable than either of us. He would say that she can attribute blood up to the size of the sovereignty woman allows, even if she does not kill us. She can attribute it to her son and to her husband, and instruct people according to his.
Okay, so now you really see, right, that the dam velo ketem discourse has really gotten off the ground here, right? And now it's kind of getting the rabbinic treatment you would expect of sort of playing with what does this category do, how can we fill it up with content, etc. And one of the responses here is, well, what about just other sources of blood, right? This was about not confronting it in a basic way of the object on which it falls is problematic. But here it's not the object. The object on which it falls is as problematic as any other object. It's that somehow I might imagine that the blood came from somewhere else. I can now displace it to another process that happened. Right? In the earlier cases, we agree came from the woman. It's just we don't have to confront it because of the material it fell on. Now we're casting aspersions as to whether we know